Hello, today I will be speaking about the controversy around stem cells and kind of what they are. And to provide a quick overview, stem cells are basically any cell in the body that is unspecialized, meaning it can develop and become a specific cell that has like a specific function and purpose in the body. So example of that is like a blood cell. So to start off, when I was first kind of considering my inquiry questions, I was mostly defining what stem cells were and what makes them possibly controversial. And so in that, I compiled a list of the three basically main points of contention. And so we have embryos, which may be an ethical or unethical source of stem cells. And then alternative to that is cell nuclear replacement techniques, or also known as therapeutic cloning as a source. And then there's also stem cell clinics in the way that they are offering treatments that may or may not be safe and effective. And then as I refined that, I developed my research question, which besides further kind of deepening the understanding about stem cells and the issues, is basically asking what we can do and what actions we can take to address some of these concerns and make it a better option. And so I think this is actually a really important question because it's becoming more relevant and more common. So I recently had an experience where I went into the doctor for jaw pain, and I was surprised because they offered me a stem cell treatment. They said that they would basically take some of my blood, and then from that they would harvest stem cells, which they would then inject into my jaw to treat the pain. And so if you haven't yet been introduced to stem cells, eventually you will, because it's just becoming more common. And I think that's why it's important to be educated and to be involved in this process, because it's becoming a matter of public affair. So the first issue I want to talk about is embryonic stem cells as the source for stem cells, or embryos as the source for stem cells. And this is basically the main way that researchers conduct studies on stem cells is through embryos. And so the problem here is that they have an embryo, and then from within the inner cell mass, they take that out and then they can harvest the stem cells from that. But then the embryo is destroyed in the process. So a very common perspective here is that kind of an anti-abortionist, which is that you're potentially destroying a life in the process. And so that's obviously has some moral and ethical implications. And in my research, I actually found this philosopher named Howard Kurzer, and he refutes some of these concerns. And so his main point was that the way researchers actually get embryos is from the leftover ones in vitro, like fertility clinics. And so what happens is these leftover embryos will either be frozen, and then if unfrozen, they would be destroyed, or they're discarded and thus destroyed. And so when they donate these to researchers, they're actually helping a positive to come out of something that would otherwise just go to waste and be destroyed anyways. And then that brings me to an alternative source, therapeutic cloning. And this little diagram here kind of shows how it works. But basically you have an egg cell, you have any type of body cell, you take the nucleus out of the body cell and put it into the egg cell, and then that is a transnuclear egg cell. And then if you let that develop in vitro, it becomes a blastocyst, which you can then use to harvest the stem cells from again. And so the really big thing here is that it doesn't harm potential lives as embryos might, because it would never naturally develop into a human being. It would require another artificial procedure of implanting the egg cell into a prepared female uterus. And so this basically negates a lot of the ethical and moral concerns from using embryonic stem cells. And so the one problem here is that it is the first step in reproductive cloning. So there is a perspective that it's going to be a slippery slope, and researchers will have to be careful that they don't start actually cloning human beings. And then there's women as the source of ova as the last issue, because we have to make sure that they are giving consent and not being exploited. And going off in a different branch here, we have stem cell clinics. So stem cells, when they were kind of first talked about to the public, people could immediately see how much potential they have for both preventing and treating disease. So they have a lot of applications. And what stem cell clinics did is they kind of just took that and ran with it. And so they started using what is called medicalization, which is basically taking a non-medical issue and then redefining it in medical terms and saying this needs treated and stem cells are the only way to treat it. And so they started on their websites, they started using subjective testimonials, and they used media coverage to kind of attract these patients, telling them we'll cure your problems. And the problem is that they're doing it with treatments that are unregulated and not approved, and it's kind of sketchy. And so the FDA's perspective here is that these stem cell clinics are basically creating products akin to illegal drugs. And so they said that puts the stem cell clinics under our jurisdiction. And so we're going to begin enforcing regulation so that we minimize the risk of financial and physical harm. Because there have been cases of people that have walked in and then walked out even worse than before, and they paid thousands of dollars. And so on the other hand, we also have the perspective of the stem cell clinics and doctors themselves. And that's basically that to run their treatments through the drug development process is both time consuming, it can take years, and it's expensive, costing thousands of dollars. And they kind of argue that in the meantime, their patients are having real results. They are seeing improvements and it's working. Why should they have to do all of that? So my first solution is kind of addressing the easier of the two, which is basically educating the public. And so what happens is that I think the FDA needs to increase their regulation because we need to hold the doctors and stem cell clinics accountable, but it's not the most feasible. It's kind of hard to make it better than what they've already done. So my main idea is that we would create a campaign basically on social media and of online resources so that we can inform the public about what stem cells are, what these treatments entail, and basically we're teaching them to think critically. So when they're presented this information on the websites, that they can evaluate whether these treatments have actually been approved or if they need to pursue better options. So that's basically a preventative step. And then my solution, kind of addressing the issue with embryonic stem cells and the transnuclear egg cells. The solution is with induced pluripotent stem cells. So these were actually discovered in 2006 by researchers Shinya Yamanaka and Kazutoshi Takahashi. And so they discovered that you could take any human body cell and basically reprogram it so that it becomes an undifferentiated stem cell. And so that completely replaces embryos, or like that need for embryos, as a stem cell source. And so that's huge because then you're also getting rid of all the ethical and moral implications. And so the only thing with this is that it only needs further refinement. There needs to be a little more research so that it can be fully implemented. So I would suggest that in this time in between, researchers can continue using embryos, specifically the leftover ones from the IVF clinics, and then they can also use therapeutic cloning. But then as soon as induced pluripotent stem cells become available, they would completely switch over. And that brings me to my conclusion. So basically, stem cells are the future. They have so much potential in the medical field. And while they are controversial in many different ways, I believe that most of those are being resolved through all of these new emerging technologies, such as the induced pluripotent stem cells. And as we continue research and regulation, we can just make it even better so that it will be safe and effective, and these treatments can change lives in the future. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.